Okay, so we are reading Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. We are in the chapter The Message of the Mystics, page 123 of my book,
Page
and
66 of the PDF.
page 66 of the PDF.
Up ahead, I caught sight of a man in a priest's robe rounding the next bend. The sight thrilled me. Totally without fear, I jogged ahead to talk with him. I knew I would know exactly what to say and do. I had a feeling of perfect well being. But to my surprise, he had disappeared. To the right, another road angled back down into the valley, but I could see no one in that direction. I ran further up in the main road, but saw no one there either. I thought about going back and taking the road I had passed, but I knew the town was ahead, so I continued to walk that way. Still, I thought several more times of the other road.
Okay, so now we need to listen, get this. In the previous paragraph, he was uplifted by the environment. So over here he says, I would know exactly what to say and do. I had a feeling of perfect well-being. Okay, so now when we are going into altered states of consciousness, we get this feeling of well-being, we get this feeling of knowing exactly what to say. It's not a question of knowing, it becomes like a download. You don't have to think and say, you just start saying, and it just becomes a relay. So you become like a relay station, which is a phenomenal thing to actually experience, because you don't have to really make any effort. You just start talking and it just bubbles out of you. And what bubbles out of you is precisely what needs to be said. And this I'm telling you from experience.
100 yards further, as I rounded another curve, I heard the roar of vehicles. Through the trees, I could see a line of military trucks approaching at a high rate of speed. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking I might stand my ground, but then I remembered the terror of the shooting on the ridge. I had time only to fling myself off the road to the right and lie still. 10 jeeps sped past me. I had landed in a spot which was completely exposed, and all I could do was hope no one looked my way. Each vehicle passed within 20 feet. I could smell the exhaust fumes and see the expression on every face. Luckily, no one noticed. After they were well past, I crawled behind a large tree. My hands were shaking, and my sensation of peace and connection was totally shattered.
Now, once again, so now what happened? He felt scared, right? As soon as he felt scared, he went on the left side of the grid. And as soon as you go into the left side of the grid, you lose the connection. So he lost the connection and his hand started shaking. And he says, my sensation of peace and connection was totally shattered. So when you want to be connected, you have to be on the right side of the grid. You cannot be connected when you're on the left side of the grid. So if you're in fear, if you're in anger, if you're in anxiety, that connection will not come. It just will not be possible.
A now familiar pang of anxiety knotted in my stomach. Finally, I inched up to the road. The sound of more vehicles sent me scurrying down the slope again as two more jeeps raced past. I felt nauseous. This time, I stayed well off the road and retreated the way I had come, moving very cautiously. I came to the road I had passed earlier. After carefully listening for sound and movement, I decided to walk through the woods beside it, angling back into the valley. My body felt heavy again. What had I been doing? I asked myself. Why had I been walking in the road? I must have been crazy, deluded by the shock of the shooting, entranced in some state of euphoria. Get real, I told myself. You have to be careful. There are people here who will kill you if you make the slightest mistake. I froze. Ahead of me, perhaps 100 feet, was the priest. He was sitting under a large tree that was surrounded by numerous rock outcroppings. As I stared at him, he opened his eyes and looked right at me. I flinched, but he only smiled and motioned for me to walk up. Cautiously, I approached him. He remained motionless, a thin, tall man of about 50 years of age. His hair was cut short and was dark brown in color, matching his eyes. You look as though you need some help, he said in perfect English. Who are you? I asked. I am Father Sanchez. And you? I explained who I was and where I was from, dizzily sinking to one knee and then to my buttocks. You were part of what happened in Kula, weren't you? He asked. What do you know of that? I asked wearily, not knowing whether to trust him. I know someone in this government is very angry, he said. They don't want the manuscript publicized. Why? I asked. He stood up and looked down at me. Why don't you come with me? Our mission is only a half mile away. You'll be safe with us. I struggled to my feet, realizing I had no choice, and nodded affirmatively. He led me slowly down the road, his manner respectful and deliberate. He weighed each word. Are the soldiers still looking for you? He asked at one point. I don't know, I replied. He had said nothing for a few minutes, then he asked, are you searching for the manuscript? Not anymore, I said. Right now, I just want to survive this and go home. He nodded reassuringly, and I found myself beginning to trust him. Something about his regard and warmth affected me. He reminded me of Will. Presently, we came to the mission, which was a cluster of small houses facing a courtyard and a small church. It was situated in a place of great beauty. As we walked up, he told some of the other robed men something in Spanish, and they scurried away. I tried to see where they were going, but fatigue was engulfing me. The priest led me into one of the houses. Inside was a small living area and two bedrooms. A fire burned in the fireplace. Soon after we entered, another priest walked in with a tray of bread and soup. Verily, I ate as Sanchez sat politely in a chair beside me. Then, upon his insistence, I stretched out on one of the beds and fell into a deep sleep. When I walked into the courtyard, I noticed immediately that the grounds were immaculately kept. The gravel walkways were edged with precisely arranged bushes and hedges. Each seemed to be placed so as to accent their full natural shape. None were trimmed. I stretched and felt the starched shirt I had put on. It was made of coarse cotton and chafed by my neck slightly. Still, it was clean and freshly ironed. Earlier, I had awakened as two priests poured hot water into a tub and laid out fresh clothes. After I had bathed and dressed, I had walked into the other room and found hot muffins and dried fruit on the table. I had eaten ravenously while the priest stood by. After I had finished, the priest had left and I had walked outside to where I now stood. I walked over and sat on one of the stone benches that faced the courtyard. The sun was just clearing the tops of the trees, warming my face. How did you sleep? A voice asked from behind me. I turned to see Father Sanchez standing very erect, smiling down at me. Very well, I replied. May I join you? Sure. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, so long, in fact, that I felt some discomfort. Several times I looked at him, preparing to say something, but he was looking in the direction of the sun, his face tilted slightly back, his eyes squinting.
So now one second over here. Now see, Father Sanchez is a person who's there, right? So he did not need to speak too much. Many times what happens is that when you are in vibratory connect with another person, then speech is not required. It just being in the presence gives you all the communication that you need. Many times you will find that when two really highly spiritual people meet, they just sit together. They don't even need to talk. Okay. Because all the communication takes place non-verbally in that higher state of consciousness.
Finally, he spoke. This is a nice place you found here. Apparently, he meant the bench at this time of the morning. Look, I need to ask your advice, I said. What is the safest way for me to get back to the United States? He looked at me seriously. I don't know. That depends on how dangerous the government thinks you are. Tell me how you happen to be in Kula. I told him everything from the time I first heard of the manuscript. My feeling of euphoria on the ridge now seemed fanciful and pretentious, so I only alluded to it briefly. Sanchez, however, immediately questioned me about it. What did you do after the soldier failed to notice you and left? He asked. I sat up there for a few hours, I replied, feeling relieved, I guess. What else did you feel? He asked. I squirmed somewhat, then decided to attempt a description. It's hard to describe, I said. I felt this euphoric connection with everything and this total kind of security and confidence. I was no longer tired.
Now this is important. So in that ridge, when he was sitting there, he went into a totally altered state of consciousness where he actually experienced the oneness with everything. So there was a deep connection which was formed, which really shifted his state of consciousness.
अच्छा
He smiled. You had a mystical experience. Many people report them in that forest near the peak. I nodded tentatively. I nodded tentatively. He turned on the bench to face me more directly. This is the experience the mystics of every religion have always described. Have you read anything about such experiences?
So now another thing here, he says, many people report them in the forest near the peak. So what does that mean? That area, that space is a high voltage energy space or a high, there may be a vortex of energy. There are many places in the earth where these vortexes form. And if you enter those spaces, you automatically go into an altered state of consciousnness. So one of the places is like Mount Shasta. There's a place over there. When I had gone there, over there in that space, in that vortex wala jo jagat, that space, everything gets wonky. In fact, I had a camera. When I took it into that space, the camera got the pictures became totally hazy. Number one, and ultimately the camera stopped functioning. So these are high energy zones, and they can have a profound effect on electronics. There are some people also, they also start getting into those altered states, and in their presence, what happens is all electronic equipment starts to malfunction. Okay, so this can happen to a person, it can happen in a place also.
Some years ago, I said, but until yesterday, it was only an intellectual concept? Yeah, I suppose. A young priest walked up and nodded to me, then whispered something to Sanchez. Sanchez nodded, and the young priest turned and walked away. The older priest watched every step the young man took. He crossed the courtyard and entered a park like area about a few hundred feet away. I noticed for the first time that this area too was also extremely clean and full of various plants. The young priest walked to several locations, hesitating at each one as though searching for something. then at one specific location sat down. He appeared to be engaged in an exercise of some kind. Sanchez smiled and looked pleased, then turned his attention to me. I think it is probably unsafe for you to attempt to go back right now, he said. But I will try to find out what the situation is, and if there is any word about your friends. He stood up and faced me. I must attend to some chores. Please understand that we will assist you in any way possible. For now, I hope you will be comfortable here, relax, and gain your strength. I nodded. He reached inside his pocket and pulled out some papers and handed them to me. This is the fifth insight. It speaks about the kind of experience you had. I think you might find it interesting. I took it reluctantly as he continued speaking. What was your understanding of the last insight you read? He asked. I hesitated. I didn't want to think about manuscripts and insights. Finally, I said that humans are stuck in a kind of competition for each other's energy. When we can get others to acquiesce to our view, they identify with us and that pulls their energy into us and we feel stronger. He smiled. So the problem is that everyone is trying to control and manipulate each other for energy because we feel short of it.
Okay, so now the first insight was that people are getting restless, and then you start noticing coincidences. The second insight was the history of evolution. The third insight was that everything is made out of energy, and this energy can be you can give and take energy. The fourth insight was that everyone wants control. So everyone is wanting to grab energy from the other person. We are attempting to control each other. So it is basically the control dramas. I think it will come later. The control drama thing is very, very insightful. So now we are coming on to the fifth insight.
That's right. But there is a solution, another source of energy. That's what the last insight implied. He nodded and walked very deliberately into the church. For a few moments, I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees, not looking at the translation. I continued to feel reluctant. The events of the last 2 days had dampened my enthusiasm, and I preferred instead to think of how I might return to the United States. Then, in the wooded area across the way, I noticed the young priest stand up and walk slowly to another location about 20 feet from where he was. He turned towards me again and sat down. I was intrigued over what he might be doing. Then it dawned on me that he might be practicing something that was spelled out in the manuscript. I looked at the first page and began to read. It described a new understanding of what has long been called mystical consciousness. During the last decades of the 20th century, it stated this consciousness would become publicized as a way of being that is actually attainable, a way that has been demonstrated by the more esoteric practitioners of many religions. For most, this consciousness would remain an intellectual concept to be only talked of and debated. But for a growing number of humans, this consciousness would become experientially real because these individuals would experience flashes or glimpses of this state of mind during the course of their lives. The manuscript said that this experience was the key to ending human conflict in the world because during this experience we are receiving energy from another source, a source we will eventually learn to tap at will.
So now, when we are going into these altered states of consciousness, our mind becomes still, and that is what most excursion participants experience. Now, normally it takes decades of meditation to be able to achieve that state of consciousness. Now, if you are not thinking too much, the brain is using a lot of the energy which is there in the body. Okay, I think about 70-80% of the energy that we generate in the body is used by the brain. Now, and every time we have a thought, there is sparking of neurons in the brain, which consumes energy. So, if we can still our mind, we go into an altered state of consciousness, we can tap into this other source of energy, which makes us feel more refreshed. Over the years, we have seen that any person who attends the Monroe programs, their requirement of sleep starts to drop. Okay, I don't know how many people are here who've attended programs, but can someone say, has your sleep requirement dropped? Can anyone unmute and say?
Mine has not gone down.
Yours has not gone down. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else's? Okay. It seems that, but what we've seen, what we hear from people is that yes, the sleep requirement definitely comes down over a period of time if you're keeping on using it. I'm sleeping for maybe 4.5, 5 hours a day, and I'm perfectly all right. Okay, so it works like that.
I stopped reading and looked at the young priest again. His eyes were open and he appeared to be looking directly at me. I nodded, even though I couldn't make out the details of his face. To my surprise, he nodded back to me and smiled faintly. Then he stood up and walked towards my left, heading towards the house in that direction. He avoided my eyes as I watched him cross the courtyard and enter the dwelling. Behind me, I heard footsteps and turned to see Sanchez leaving the church. He smiled as he approached me. That didn't take long, he said. Would you like to see more of the grounds? Yes, I would, I replied. Tell me about these sitting areas you have. I pointed towards the area where the young priest had been. Let's walk up there, he said. As we strolled across the courtyard, Sanchez told me that the mission was over 400 years old and was founded by a unique missionary from Spain who felt the way to convert the local Indians was through their hearts, not through coercion with the sword. The approach had worked. Sanchez went on, and partly because of this success, and partly due to the remote location, the priest had been left alone to follow his own course. We carry on his tradition of looking inward for the truth, Sanchez said. The sitting area was landscaped immaculately. After about half an acre of dense forest had been cleared, and the bushes and the flowering plants beneath were interspersed with walkways made of smooth river stone, like those in the courtyard. The plants here were also spaced perfectly, accentuating their unique shape. Where would you like to sit down? Sanchez asked. I looked around at my options. In front of us were several arranged area nooks which seemed complete unto themselves. All contained open spaces surrounded by beautiful plants and rocks and large trees of varying shapes. One to our left, where the young priest had been last sitting, had more outcroppings of stone. How about over there? I said. He nodded and we walked over and sat down. Sanchez breathed deeply for several minutes, then looked at me. Tell me more about your experience on the ridge, he said. I felt resistant. I don't know what else I can say about it. It didn't last. The priest looked at me sternly. Just because it ended when you became afraid again doesn't negate its importance, does it? Perhaps it is something to be regained.
So now this is important. When you're holding that state of consciousness, if you get into anger or any other such thing which comes into your mind because of habit, then you will drop again. So the more you go into these altered states, the more stable it starts becoming for you. Over a period of time, you can actually exist in that expanded state of consciousness, not having to come back to this normal 3D consciousness. Okay, but again, you can also exist in 3D and in those expanded states simultaneously. That's what the mystics actually could achieve and do. So, what he's saying over here is just because it ended because you got afraid doesn't negate the experience that you had. You can always recreate that particular experience because once you've experienced something and you get the flavor and taste of it, you can always go back into that state of consciousness.
Maybe, I said, but it's hard for me to concentrate on feeling cosmic when people are trying to kill me. He laughed, then looked at me warmly. Are you studying the manuscript here at the mission? I asked. Yes, he said. We teach others how to pursue the kind of experience you had on the ridge. You wouldn't mind getting some of that feeling back, would you? A voice from the courtyard interrupted, a priest calling for Sanchez. The older man excused himself and walked down to the courtyard and talked with the priest who had summoned him. I sat back and looked at the plants and rocks nearby, taking my eyes slightly out of focus. Around the bush closest to me, I could barely make out an area of light, but when I tried it on the rocks, I could see nothing.
Okay, so now it is easier to see the energy field and the aura around a living thing. So with plants, it is pretty easy to see their field. If you just defocus and it's against a white background, you can easily see the energy field around plants. Around inanimate objects, the energy field is there, but it's a little more difficult to see it.
Then I noticed Sanchez walking back. I must leave for a while, he said as he reached me. I'll be going into town for a meeting, so perhaps I can acquire some information concerning your friends, or at least how safe it is for you to travel. Good, I said. Will you be back today? I don't think so, he replied. More like tomorrow morning. I must have looked insecure because he walked closer and placed his hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, you are safe here. Please make yourself at home. Look around. It is fine to talk with any of the priests, but understand that some of them will be more receptive than others depending on their development. I nodded.
So again, the higher the development, the more developed the one of the priests is, the more open they will be to talking because they have less fear when you go into higher states of consciousness.
He smiled and walked behind the church and entered an old truck I had not noticed. After several attempts, it started and he drove around the back of the church and onto the road leading back up the ridge. For several hours, I remained in the sitting area, content to gather my thoughts, wondering if Marjorie was all right and if Will had escaped. Several times, the image of Jensen's man being killed flashed across my mind, but I fought off the memory and tried to stay calm. About noon, I noticed several priests were preparing a long table in the center of the courtyard with dishes of food. When they finished, a dozen or more other priests joined them and began serving their own plates and eating on the benches casually. Most of them smiled pleasantly at each other, but I could hear little talking. One of them looked up at me and pointed to the food. I nodded and walked down to the courtyard and prepared a plate of corn and beans. Each of the priests seemed very conscious of my presence, but no one spoke to me. I made several comments about the food, but my words were met only with smiles and polite gestures. If I attempted direct eye contact, they would lower their eyes.
So what was happening? The priests did not speak when they were eating. Okay.
I sat down on one of the benches alone and ate. The vegetables and beans were unsalted but spiced with herbs. When lunch was over and the priests were stacking their plates on the table, another priest walked out of the church and hastily prepared a plate. When he finished, he looked around for a place to sit and our eyes met. He smiled and I recognized him as the priest who had looked at me from the sitting area earlier. I returned his smile and he walked over and spoke to me in broken English. May I sit on bench with you? He asked. Yes, please, I replied. He sat down and began to eat very slowly, over chewing his food and smiling up at me occasionally. He was short and small with a wiry build and coal black hair. His eyes were a lighter brown. You like the food? He asked. I was holding my plate in my lap. Several bites of corn remained. Oh, yes, I said, and took a bite. I noticed again how slowly and deliberately he chewed and tried to do the same. And then it struck me that all of the priests had been eating that way.
So if you eat slowly, it gives a chance for the saliva to mix with the food, and also it crushes the food a lot so that the digestion automatically becomes better.
Are the vegetables grown here at the mission? I asked. He hesitated before answering, swallowing slowly. Yes, food is very important. Do you meditate with the plants? I asked. He looked at me with obvious surprise. You have read manuscript? He asked. Yes, the first four insights. Have you grown food? He asked. Oh no, I'm just learning about all this. Do you see energy fields? Yes, sometimes. We sat in silence for a few minutes while he carefully ate several more bites. Food is the first way of gaining energy, he said. I nodded. But in order to totally absorb energy in food, the food must be appreciated. Eh.
So again, if you just eat the food for the sake of eating it, you'll really not get all the prana which is there in the food. You have to eat it with appreciation. So that was the reason of grace, of apne bhog lagate hain, of any kind of a this thing, that you're first offering it to a higher state of consciousness and then consuming the food makes you feel gratitude towards the food that you are eating. So you go into appreciation.
He seemed to be struggling for the right English word. Savored, he finally said. Taste is the doorway. You must appreciate taste. This is the reason for prayer before eating. It is not just about being thankful, it is to make eating a holy experience so the energy from the food can enter your body.
So the prana enters your body. If you make it a holy and a spiritual experience. So any experience can become a spiritual experience.
He looked closely at me as though to see whether I understood. I nodded without comment. He looked thoughtful. What he was telling me, I reasoned, was that this kind of deliberate appreciation of food was the real purpose behind the normal religious custom of being thankful, with the result being a higher energy absorption of the food. But taking in food is only first step, he said. After personal energy is increased in this way, you become more sensitive to energy in all things. And then you learn to take this energy into yourself without eating.
So
I
this is what breatharians do. Okay, we had one of Eli Tom, a breatharian. He came and gave us a talk where he hardly eats anything. So once you connect with that energy, you are able to absorb the energy from the prana, from just breathing. Okay, so you can just absorb it, and you can actually reduce or eliminate eating food at all. Many of our Rishi Munis actually used to do it. There was a video also where this gentleman was over 100 years old and he had not eaten food for last 20 or 30 years, and he was still hale and hearty and surviving beautifully. So again, it is possible to survive without eating food.
nodded affirmatively. Everything around us, he continued, has energy, but each has its own special kind. That is why some places increase energy more than others. It depends on how your shape fits with the energy there.
So again, it is a matter of resonance. What resonates with you and what uplifts you. So what may work for one person may not work for another.
Is that what you were doing up there earlier? I asked, increasing your energy. He looked pleased. Yes. How do you do that? I asked. You have to be open, to connect, to use your sense of appreciation, as in seeing feels. But you take this one step further so that you get the sensation of being filled up. I'm not sure I follow you.
So what was this? When you are open and you are connected, you can actually fill up energy. It's like we are going to a petrol station and filling up our petrol tank. Okay, so you can actually just absorb the energy and fill yourself up. The key again being appreciation or gratitude.
He frowned at my denseness. Would you like to walk back to the sitting place? I can show you. Okay, I said. Why not? I followed as he led the way across the courtyard and back to the sitting area. As we arrived, he stopped and looked around as if surveying the area for something. Over there, he said, pointing to a spot that bordered the dense forest. We followed the path as it wound through the trees and bushes. He picked a spot in front of a large tree that grew out of a mound of boulders so that its huge trunk seemed to be perched on the rocks. Its roots wrapped around and through the boulders before finally reaching the soil. Flowering shrubs of some type grew in semicircles in front of the tree, and I could detect a strange sweet fragrance from the shrub's yellow blossoms. The dense forest provided a solid sheet of green in the background. The priest directed me to sit down in a clear spot amid the bushes, facing the gnarled tree. He sat beside me. Do you think the tree is beautiful? He asked. Yes. Then feel it. Uh, seemed to be struggling again to find the word. He thought for a moment and then asked, Father Sanchez told me that you had an experience on the ridge. Can you remember how you felt? I felt light and secure and connected. How connected? It is hard to describe, I said, like the whole landscape was part of me. But what was the feeling? I thought for a minute. What was the feeling? Then it came to me. Love, I said. I guess I felt a love for everything. Yes, he said. That is it. Feel that love for the tree. But wait a minute, I protested. Love is something that just happens. I can't make myself love anything. You do not make yourself love, he said. You allow love to enter you. But to do this, you must position your mind by remembering what it felt like and try to feel it again.
So again, so you do not make yourself love. You allow love to enter. So that means that, it's a shift in states, it's a shift in consciousness. And trying here is counterproductive. It just happens. So you have to allow it to happen. You have to allow it to seep into you. And you have to remember that feeling. That feeling is very important. So whenever we are going into these states of consciousness, that feeling that you had can take you back into that state of consciousness very fast, provided you actually grout it. You just remember that particular feeling when you get that feeling of wholeness and oneness.
I looked at the tree and tried to remember the emotion on the ridge. Gradually, I began to admire its shape and presence. My appreciation grew until I actually felt an emotion of love. The feeling was exactly the one I remember as a child for my mother and as a youth for the special little girl that was the object of my puppy love. Yet, even though I had been looking at the tree, this particular love existed as a general background feeling. I was in love with everything. The priest slid away several feet and looked back at me intensely. Good, he said. You are accepting the energy.
So again, over here, even though I was looking at this tree, this particular love existed as a general background feeling. So when we go into these states, that feeling of love exists everywhere around us. Okay, it becomes a part of your being. It becomes a part of everything around you, which then connects you into that state of oneness.
I noticed his eyes were slightly out of focus. How do you know? I asked. Because I can see your energy field getting larger.
So again, over here, I noticed his eyes were slightly out of focus. So when we are looking with our normal state, the way we normally look, it is not possible to see what we normally do not see. So if we want to see something we do not normally see, we have to shift the way in which we are seeing. So you have to defocus your eyes. And generally speaking, what we also say is that if you focus your attention 6 inches behind whatever you are focusing on, you will be able to start seeing the aura.
I closed my eyes and tried to reach the intense feelings I had acquired on the ridge top, but I couldn't duplicate the experience. What I was feeling was on the same continuum, but to a lesser degree than before. The failure made me frustrated.
So he was not hitting it. Okay. The point is that when we, with practice, you can actually start hitting that state of consciousness very consistently. Since he had only experienced it once, he couldn't get to that state or shift into that particular state of consciousness.
What happened? He asked. Your energy fell. I don't know, I said. I just couldn't do it as strongly as before. He just looked at me, amused at first, then with impatience. What you experienced on the ridge was a gift, a breakthrough, a look at new way. Now you must learn to get that experience by yourself, a little at a time. He slid, he slid back a foot further and looked at me again. Now try more. I closed my eyes and tried to feel deeply. Eventually, the emotion swept over me again. I stayed with it, attempting to increase the feeling by small increments. I focused my regard on the tree. That is very good, he suddenly said. You are receiving energy and giving it to the tree. I looked at him squarely. I'm giving it back to the tree? When you appreciate the beauty and uniqueness of things, he explained, you receive energy. When you get to a level where you feel love, then you can send the energy back just by willing it so. For a long time, I sat there with the tree. The more I focused attention on the tree and admired its shape and color, the more love I seemed to acquire generally, an unusual experience. I imagined my energy flowing over and filling up the tree, but I couldn't see it. Without changing my focus, I noticed the priest get up and begin to walk away. What does it look like when I am giving energy to the tree? I asked. He described the perception in detail, and I recognized it as the same phenomenon I had witnessed when Sarah projected her energy onto the philodendron at Vicente. Though Sarah was successful, she apparently wasn't aware that a state of love was necessary for the projection to take place. She must have been acquiring a love state naturally, without realizing it. The priest walked down towards the courtyard and out of my range of vision. I remained in the sitting area until dusk.
So again, projecting energy and receiving energy. The more we can be in the state, the better off we are.
The two priests nodded politely as I entered the house. A roaring fire fended off the evening chill, and several oil lamps illuminated the front room. The air was filled with the smell of vegetable or perhaps potato soup. On the table was a ceramic bowl, several spoons, and a plate holding 4 slices of bread. One of the priests turned and left without looking at me, and the other kept his eyes lowered and nodded at a large cast iron pot sitting on the hearth by the fire. A handle protruded from under its lid. As soon as I saw the pot, the second priest asked, "Is there anything else you need?" "I think not," I said. "Thank you." He nodded and left the house as well, leaving me alone. I lifted the lid from the pot potato soup. It smelled rich and delicious. I poured several ladles full into a bowl and sat down at the table, then pulled the part of the manuscript Sanchez had given me from my pocket and placed it beside my plate, intending to read. But the soup tasted so good that I focused entirely on eating. After I finished, I placed the dishes in a large pan and stared at the fire, hypnotized until the flames burned low. Then I turned down the lamps and went to bed. The next morning, I awakened at dawn feeling totally refreshed. Outside, a morning mist rolled through the courtyard. I stoked up the fire and put several pieces of kindling on the coals and fanned it until it caught up. I was about to look through the kitchen for food when I heard Sanchez's truck approaching. I walked outside as he emerged from behind the church, a backpack in one arm and several packages in the other. "I have some news," he said, motioning me to follow him back inside the house. Several other priests appeared with hot corn cakes and grits and more dried fruit. Sanchez greeted the men, then sat with me at the table as the priests scurried away. "I attended a meeting of some of the priests of the Southern Council," he said. "We were there to talk about the manuscript. At issue was the government's aggressive actions. This was the first time any group of priests had met publicly in support of this document, and we were just beginning our discussion when a government representative knocked on the door and asked to be admitted. He paused as he served his plate and took several bites, chewing them thoroughly. The representative," he continued, "assured us that the government's sole purpose was to protect the manuscript from outside exploitation. He informed us that all copies being held by Peruvian citizens must be from outside must be licensed. Sorry. He informed us that all copies being held by Peruvian citizens must be licensed. He said he understood our concern but asked us to comply with this law and turn in our copies. He promised that government duplicates would be issued back to us at once." "Did you turn them in?" I asked. "Of course not." We both ate for a few minutes. I tried to overchew to appreciate the taste. "We asked about the violence in Kula," he went on, "and he told us that this was a necessary reaction against a man called Jensen, that several of his men were armed agents from another country. He said they planned to find and steal the undiscovered part of the manuscript and remove it from Peru. So the government had no choice but to arrest them. There was no mention of you or your friends." "Did you believe the government man?" "No, we didn't. After he left, we continued the meeting. We agreed that our policy would be one of quiet resistance. We will continue to make copies and distribute them carefully." "Will your church leaders allow you to do that?" I asked. "We don't know," Sanchez said. "The church elders have disapproved of the manuscript, but so far have not seriously investigated who is involved with it. Our main concern is a cardinal who resides further north, Cardinal Sebastian. He is the most vocal in opposition to the manuscript and is very influential. If he convinces the leadership to issue strong proclamations, then we will have a very interesting decision to make." "Why is he so opposed to the manuscript?" "He is afraid." "Why?" "I haven't spoken with him in a long time. and we always avoid the subject of the manuscript. But I believe he thinks man's role is to participate in the cosmos, ignorant of spiritual knowledge, by faith alone. He thinks the manuscript will undermine the status quo, the lines of authority in the world.
So again, the people in power are always scared of change because any change can result in their downfall.
I haven't spoken with him in a long time, and we always avoid the subject of the manuscript. But I believe he thinks man's role is to participate in the cosmos, ignorant of spiritual knowledge by faith alone. He thinks the manuscript will undermine the status quo, the lines of authority in the world. How would it do that? He smiled and tilted his head back slightly. The truth shall set you free. I was looking at him, trying to understand what he meant, eating the last of the bread and fruit on my plate. He ate several more tiny bites and pushed his chair back. You seem much stronger, he said. Did you talk with anyone here? Yes, I replied. I learned a method of connecting with the energy from one of the priests. I didn't catch his name. He was in the sitting area while we were talking in the courtyard yesterday morning. Remember? When I spoke with him later, he showed me how to absorb energy and then to project it back. His name is John, Sanchez said, then nodded for me to go on. It was an amazing experience, I said. By remembering the love, I felt I was able to open up. I sat up there all day, simmering in it. I didn't reach the state I experienced on the ridge, but I got close. Sanchez looked more serious. The role of love has been misunderstood for a long time. Love is not something we should do to be good or to make the world a better place out of some abstract moral responsibility or because we should give up our hedonism. Connecting with energy feels like excitement, then euphoria, and then love. Finding enough energy to maintain that state of love certainly helps the world, but it most directly helps us. It is the most hedonistic thing we can do.
So again, love is not something we should do to be good or to make the world a better place out of some abstract moral responsibility. It needs to come from your heart. Needs to come from the deepest part of your own state of being. It needs to become a part of your being totally, that you become love. So everything, when you are in love, everything becomes beautiful. Everything becomes fantastic. Everything starts moving perfectly because you are jacked in. Now, if you can inculcate that feeling all the time, then automatically everything around you will become beautiful and the energy will keep pumping up instead of getting depleted most of the time.
I agreed, then noticed he had moved his chair back several more feet and was looking at me intensely, his eyes unfocused. So, what does my field look like? I asked. It is much larger, he said. I think you feel very good. I do. Good. That is what we do here. Tell me about that, I said. We train priests to go further into the mountains and work with the Indians. It is a lonely job, and the priests must have great strength. All of the men here have been screened thoroughly, and all have one thing in common. Each has had one experience he calls mystical. I have been studying this kind of experience for many years, he continued, even before the manuscript was found. And I believe that when one has already encountered a mystical experience, getting back into the state and raising one's personal energy level comes much easier. Others can also connect, but it takes longer. A strong memory of the experience, as I think you learned, facilitates its recreation. After that, one slowly builds back.
So again, in the workshops, we always tell people keep observing what you are experiencing. Keep observing what you are experiencing. Simply because if you can remember all that happened when you were having that particular mystical experience, you can recreate it by just connecting with whatever was happening with you. So some people get whirlpools in the hand, some people get a feeling here, some people get a floaty feeling, some people see some colors. So if you can connect to that exact thing, like that, you can go into the altered state of consciousness.
What does a person's energy field look like when this is happening? It grows outward and changes color slightly. What color? Normally from a dull white towards green and blue. But the most important thing is that it expands. For instance, during your mystical encounter on the ridge top, your energy flashed outward into the whole universe. Essentially, you connected and drew energy from the entire cosmos, and in turn, your energy swelled to encompass everything, everywhere. Can you remember how that felt?
Now, this is important again. Okay. So when Dr. Brian Daly and Alan had given a talk, they had shown one video clip where this person is just giving love energy to that entire landscape, and the energy field totally changes in the biofield image picture that he had taken. Boom! It acts like as if it's been flooded by light, that entire landscape. So when we are connected, we can actually give energy to the landscape, to the environment, to the plants, to everything around us. And they in turn will automatically give us energy also, because we are connected at a quantum level.
Yea, I said. I felt as though the entire universe was my body and I was just the head, or perhaps more accurately, the eyes. Yes, he said, and at that moment your energy and that of the universe were the same. The universe was your body.
So at that moment, your energy and the universe's energy was the same. So you went into perfect resonance, and then you became one. Okay, so you shifted totally to wholeness or to oneness. And this is what all meditation, all spiritual practices are actually aspiring for. That you totally become one with what there is. I think we can stop here.
Let's just finish this page so that we can start with the
Okay,
next page.
go ahead.
I had a strange memory during that time, I said. I seem to remember how this larger body, this universe of mine, evolved. I was there. I saw the first stars formed from simple hydrogen and then saw more complex matter evolve in successive generations of these suns. Only I didn't see matter. I saw matter as simple vibrations of energy that was evolving systematically into ever more complex higher states. Then life began and evolved to a point where humans appeared. I stopped suddenly and he noticed my changed mood. What's wrong? He said.
Okay. So again, this was the second insight, right? So where he actually felt and he went through the entire evolutionary process. So everything is interrelated, everything is connected, everything is ultimately made out of the same matter, same stuff, all energy. And this is what the topic of discussion in today's 9:15 talk is: energy, vibrations, and how they affect us. So it will be an interesting connection that we will have today. What is the page number, Shivendra?
76
Okay.
of the PDF.
Yeah. Anyone, anything to say? Anyone, anything to say?
Very nice, Nikki.
Yes, Sanjana.
Today I'm traveling, so I could be on it.
Yeah, great,
I'm
wonderful.
return
So it was
returning.
your talk. Everyone, Anjana is also practicing, turning into a breatharian. I don't know if she's there or not. You can share your experience, Anjana.
I'm there, of course.
No, no, I'm
Yeah,
saying
it's
that you're shifting to
uh,
becoming a breatharian, right?
well. I'm right now on living food, not
Okay.
cooked.
Okay.
So once a week, I try and be on no food, no water.
Okay. And
Yeah.
you're targeting increasing that?
Yeah, slowly.
Okay. Great. Chali, anyone, anything else before we wrap up?
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Ram Ram.
Ram Ram.
I think everyone's
Ram.
baptized or something.
Thank
No one
you.
wants to say
Ram
anything.
Ram.
Ram Ram.
Thank you.
I want to say something. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Sharon,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
I liked the Srimangal auntie's voice while she reading.
Hmm. Good.
And yeah, I felt very good after
Very,
reading the book.
very
And
good.
yeah, many things got to know after reading this chapter.
Very
I
good.
hope you didn't fall asleep.
No, not at all.
So it connects with a lot of stuff that we did in the workshop also, right?
Yes, yeah,
Isn't it?
yes.
So this feeling of oneness, etc., which he's talking about, that's also something that you experience in the workshop.
Yes, now I'm doing the one breath technique also.
Very good. Excellent. Excellent.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you for the
Okay.
teaching everything.
Thank you.
Ram Ram.
Ram Ram.
Ram Ram.
Ram
Welcome.
Ram
Ram.
Ram.
Thank you,
Ram
Bhaiya. Thank you,
Thank you.
Shimangla. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Welcome,
Ram
welcome.
Thank
Ram.
you.
Ram Ram.
Chaliye, so we'll see you all for meditation and for the
Yeah.
9:15.
Yeah. Thank you,
Sure.
Bhaiya.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaiya.
Thank you.